So, Daniel, thank you very much
Yes,
for accepting my invitation.
my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
So, I have your book. I liked it very much. I found it in a Brazilian library here in downtown Sao Paulo, and it was instant love. I will give you my quick review of the book, if we could say. I think it's very interesting for a Brazilian or a Latin American reader for several reasons. First, it's very funny. You will never get bored by reading all the adventures, the anecdotes, and the short stories you use as a matrix of your book. It's very articulate and well documented, and also it's diverse. It's not only about Africa. That was my feeling at the introduction of the book. I said, oh, one more book about poor Africa. But no, you drive us to Dubai, China, which is a fantastic topic, and it's also a topic that is very relevant for Brazilian audience, because I think China is our first or second commercial partner. And you drive us also to Russia, the Russia of Mr. Putin, which is very interesting, and also to the inside life of Washington, D.C. So for all these reasons, I think that your book is very interesting for a Brazilian audience. Of course, for people who are in a diplomatic career or preparing themselves to work for NGO or a diplomatic corps, but also for anyone who is interested in understanding the structure of power and international relations.
Thank you.
So maybe let's start with Brazil. We are in the middle of what they call the Lava Jato scandal. It's big corruption scandal that spans all the areas of government, local, state, and federal. What is your impression about Brazil? I would say from the US. Do you see it as a giant that it will be forever a potential that will never come to life?
Look, Brazil is an economic superpower, not just commercially, but also if you look at military industry, for example, it has tremendous weight. I'm not saying anything new. You're obviously aware of the BRICS, which started just as an acronym, but now is more formalized. Brazil plays an important role in that. The BRICS states represent 3.6 billion people. That's 40% of the world's population. So. And Brazil is a very big part of that. I would say a bigger part than South Africa, which joined in 2015. At the same time, Brazil is a huge trading partner of China, an important trading partner. And it has adopted a lot of China's economic development model, which you see very much in Africa. As you know, China initiated recently this AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank,
right?
And so the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the Chinese model based on Deng Xiaoping of economic development through enormous infrastructure investments, as opposed to the neoclassical model of domestic consumption and export-driven economy. Now, we can debate the merits of that. It's definitely a change from the neoclassical economic model, and it is a big economic debate. But in the Brazilian context, and the reason I'm bringing this up is that without a doubt, large-scale infrastructure developments have massive potential for corruption.
Right.
And you saw it with some of the largest companies in Brazil, the Odebrecht scandal, which has gone all of Latin America and South America, even Africa, but certainly has corrupted not just Brazil, but other countries. It's really, and the Petrobras scandals that came with that. So these are all massive infrastructure-driven investments that open doors for corruption. You can find corruption wherever you want, but these are opportunities on a much larger scale. So I think that I'm not someone who likes to generalize about the nature of, let's say, people talk about Nigerian crime, for example, and is there something inherently corrupt about Nigeria? I don't believe that, even though there is a fantastic book by a historian who passed away recently called Stephen Ellis about the origins of Nigerian crime. I recommend it also for the Brazilian audience and the colonial history of that. But generally, I believe that the corruption situation in Brazil that has a strong context with these massive infrastructure initiatives, because they were the most corrupting influence. Now, after a few years and generations, you of course develop a certain culture of corruption that seeps through the entire political leadership. I think this has been what has been so terribly frustrating, is that you impeach one president and you get another one who is again implied, and then the one who preceded the one who was impeached now was sentenced for corruption. So you start to feel that this is a hydra that you cut off of a head and you get two new ones.
Yeah.
And I think this perception of hopelessness is maybe more of a cancer than the corruption itself.
I tend to agree with you. For most, in elites in Brazil, entering into politics is kind of shameful. They try to avoid participating, which is a tragedy, a massive tragedy. They rather go to investment finance or agro-business or emigrate to the States or Hong Kong, but never go to Brasilia. I think it's the biggest tragedy of today's Brazil. The sense of hopelessness,
What I was saying is that you see it's not only limited to Brazil. You see the same thing in Washington, what you just described, that the talented, motivated young generation who have something to contribute to a society no longer choose to go into politics, directly or indirectly. They may choose to go into technology, into Silicon Valley, into finance, into other areas. But politics now is considered so unappealing that they no longer attract the talented. And after a generation or two, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what you get. You get very untalented, self-interested individuals.
Absolutely. And policy made by co-opted people that still live in the same ecosystem. Right. I think that there is a second factor in Brazil that maybe is typically Brazilian. It's the fact that Brazil lives as an isolated country. We are a gated country by construction, by a lot of laws, unlike maybe the USA or even Western Europe. I don't know Africa enough, but in Brazil we have a lot of laws, of regulations that deter foreign investors or deter foreign talents to enter the market. Maybe it does also foster corruption.
Yes, but I remember working as a young lawyer in the mid-90s around the peso crisis in Mexico in '95, where Brazil emerged as the most attractive origination of South American, Latin American companies that wanted to come to the US market for IPOs or for the debt markets. Brazil suddenly emerged as this unbelievably attractive, and you saw it in many funny ways. For example, in my law firm, suddenly there were massive amount of influx of young Brazilian attorneys who were hired in order to service these transactions. So I saw this massive explosion, and Brazil was considered, the land of unlimited opportunities in South America, in particular because it coincided with the crisis in Mexico and in hyperinflation in Argentina.
Right. But you mentioned Odebrecht or other infrastructure company, and this is typically an area where Brazil is close to US company. You don't see here, the big names, the big ones, or I would not mention names here, but you don't see them. It's also the same business of 3 or 4 big names: Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, OAS, and some others, all in the Lava Jato scandal. And
yes, but there are the most lucrative type of investments in a country are often close to foreign investors. It's, for example, you take the explosion of the shale industry in the United States that's driven almost exceptions to that, but for the most part, you're not inviting, let's say, large French or British or Chinese or Russian oil and gas companies to participate in this, or Saudi companies. They do this sometimes through ownership, but generally you see protectionist streaks everywhere, except in countries that cannot afford to do it because they need the capital support.
Yeah. I got your point. Let's now maybe move to next area, the relationship between corruption and incompetence. We spoke already about it in the text interview, and you have a very interesting view. You say that basically that incompetence is the illegitimate child of corruption. Am I right?
Yes. It's how shall I put it? It's there are harsh ways to say it. You could say that incompetence is the corruption had an abortion. It was called incompetence, and it lived. Essentially, that's sort of the really ugly way to put it. I think that you can of course make a point that corruption and incompetence are related but parallel factors. Then they're correlated, but you can't draw a real analogy. My point, for purposes of our discussion, was that corruption breeds incompetence, because corruption, one of the most pernicious side effects of corruption is that it leads to the promotion of less competent people. It's the opposite of a meritocracy. So if you look at, a state that is not well governed, you often have a family ruling it, and far less talented people within the family or their friends or people they need for support in positions of power. It's one sign of corruption, which, by the way, you're seeing in Washington, D.C. today, which is that you have basically a family running, and if you want to accomplish something, you need access to the family. What you end up with that is that you'll have less competent people in key positions, A, because they're not promoted, and B, because the really talented people say they're going to sit this out. They're not going to expose themselves to.
Right. So it's a kind of the perfect system, I mean, for the corrupt, because it expels the talented and the honest people.
It's perfect in a very short-term, cynical way, but if you have, it's perfect in the sense of a zero-sum game. If you're talking about leadership that just wants to stay in power for as long as the party is going on, it's a perfect system. If you're talking about leadership that has any kind of expectation of improving the state of a country, it's disastrous, of course. It's completely deadly.
Yeah, of course. Unfortunately, it's the situation in most countries around the world. Don't you think so?
Yes, in some form or another. I think, and I write this in my book, in the chapter on the State Department. I don't just look at corruption as cases of, sinister people with sunglasses landing at an airport. What kind of corruption still allows for a healthy development of a country, and at what point does corruption become so deadly? I tell the story in a book that a young lady from Kenya told me after a meeting at the United Nations. I don't know if you remember the story, but it's maybe worth telling because it's so telling. A joke really that she had heard from her father, where pre-independence in the 50s, a young Kenyan student and a young Southeast Asian student, pre-independence, studied at Oxford together, and they become good friends, and then they go back to the Minister of Finance. And after a few years, the Kenyan or the Ugandan, let's say, visits his friend in Singapore, just for argument's sake, and he sees the whole city rising and developing, and says, "How did you do this?" And the minister says, "Look, it was easy. Let's say we needed a road, and I made a tender, and someone won the bid, and I took 10% for myself, and it got done." And his Kenyan friend says, "That's a great idea." A few years later, the Singaporean minister visits his Kenyan friend, and he looks out, and there's nothing, just dirt roads and sewage, and he says, "What happened? We talked about it." And his friend says, "Look, I did exactly what you said. We put out a tender for a road. I took 100% for myself, and nothing happened." So obviously between 10 and 100% is the debate, and I'm not in any way justifying corruption, but if you assume that corruption is in human nature, you're going to always have some. The question is, at which point do you completely stifle development and development of a nation also?
I agree with you. I'm coming myself from an emerging country, and I can say that when you move from a country to another, you can really check the level of corruption and its impact. I would say it's devastating impact.
You're from Morocco, right?
Right.
So, but for example, Morocco, they got a few things wrong in their privatization, but they also got a few things right. Morocco is, for example, one of the only countries that separated the valuation of the privatized companies from the execution of the privatization, and it removed a big source of corruption in this process. So you really can learn. I think the key part in what my message in the book was in terms of development is not to be a snob just because you're educated in the West and you think that you're here to teach the rest of the world. I think that's silly. There are really important lessons to be learned from countries, and sometimes lessons from a bad experience too. And a little more humility in development would serve everyone quite well, actually.
Actually, I agree with you, and we don't see any MBA of anti-corruption. Am I right? Or kind of, academic knowledge that would be practical.
There is, in a very legalistic way, there is. So if you go to law school and there are going to be classes about it, in business school there might be classes about it, where you really would need to do it is in psychology departments. Because the only way to really combat corruption is to provide incentives for good behavior. Legitimate incentives for good behavior. In other words, for example, if you are an employee of a company and you have real access to resources, you have to provide that employee with the incentive to deal with it properly, with the recognition of having done a good job, with everything around that, to build an incentive system. So to me, it's more of a psychological challenge. But I'll tell you a funny anecdote, which I didn't have in my book, but I was asked many years ago to do an anti-corruption project in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, or in one of the countries. And now the country shall remain nameless, but in one of the Gulf monarchies. And the object of the project was to establish an anti-corruption authority, legislation, and then help with the implementation. And as we were negotiating the establishment, we also had to negotiate the budget for this authority. And the person who was identified as the president of this anti-corruption agency, who was a very prominent local person related to that royal family, when we sat down, we had agreed on a budget, and at the end of the evening, he and I were just sitting together having a conversation. He said, okay, now talk about my pension fund. He didn't know, and we're talking about a fabulous wealthy individual in a fabulously wealthy country, as the Gulf monarchies are.
It's crazy.
And essentially what he was asking was for a kickback for the establishment of his anti-corruption authority.
Wow.
It was one of those experiences that, you know, you can't really make that stuff up. I was, for a moment, thought maybe I'm on candid camera. Maybe he's testing me and he's making a funny joke on me, but he was really serious. And we had to abandon the project because obviously there's no way that even, what's the point of having that conversation? You're way beyond anything reasonable. But it's just to show, and when I challenged him, you know, I could see in his reaction that he thought I just didn't understand how business is done. For him, it wasn't a moral question. It was really just a matter of how business is done. And I think if you want to change the way people behave, you first of all have to change the minds. You really have to change. And to change that, you really have to create a completely different awareness of what corruption really does to a country.
Right. Agree.
And so that, which is, by the way, the problem with most financial crimes, whether it's insider trading, people always believe that they are faceless, victimless crimes.
Yeah.
When in fact, of course, corruption is not victimless.
Absolutely. And you spoke about moral, which is very close to religion. And I come from a Muslim country, and the level of corruption is very high. Not that high as in maybe Nigeria or other countries, but I would say that in most Muslim countries, corruption is high, and we can say also this of other religious areas. And I feel there is a disconnection between the moral of the religion, or the official one, or what people play in the big human theater, and the reality of corruption. Because if they were abiding by the moral precepts of whatever religion, there would be no corruption, and also no violence per se, if you see it in a literal way.
Yeah, but I think that's no different than looking, not only, just like you look at religion, you can look at the secular constitution or a secular law, which also is supposed to have a moral content, and it's being violated because people justify their choices not as moral questions, but for any other reason. You know, this is one of the astonishing things which I write in the introduction to my book, that what surprised me was not the fact that corruption exists or that incompetence exists. I mean, that would be silly to be surprised about that. What I always found so astonishing and remarkable when I encountered it was the way individuals justified their bad choices. There was always this sense that they are in fact necessary for their countries, that they're providing a much higher good for their country, that their countries would perish without them, which is the same reason that you see dictators stay in power forever. You know, the tragedy, one of Africa's tragedies is that people never leave power.
Right.
Whether you're talking about Equatorial Guinea, whether you're talking about Uganda now, whether you're talking about the upcoming elections in Rwanda with constitutional amendments in order to remove age or term limits. So when you are starting, so of course somebody who stays in power forever, now you see in DRC Congo the tragedy that Kabila is refusing to leave in violation of his constitution.
Angola?
Those are Angola, of course. Now he's decided he's going to leave Dos Santos. But when you see that, you're seeing the origins of this justification. These leaders, if you talk to them, and I've spoken to several of them, all believe that they are essential for the survival of their countries, that their countries will sink without them. So, and then you start to unravel. So in other words, somebody who's in power for 30 years or longer in some cases even, with their families in power, with their friends in power through that, it's impossible to avoid corruption in that kind of a situation. Simply impossible. It's institutionalized corruption.
I've been watching a documentary on Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso. He was in power for 4 years, 83 to 87, and he was shot by his colleague, Blaise Compaoré. And Thomas Sankara must have. I don't think that Thomas Sankara was corrupt. The question in my mind, maybe he was killed because he was not corrupt. He was not playing the right game, and also with the Western powers. So maybe there is a balance there, because maybe they are corrupt. I'm not finding them excuses, but when they are corrupt, they are in a big matrix of interest, and they think maybe that it guarantees their survival as a dictator.
I don't know. One other way to answer what you just said was, I once had this conversation with a South African friend of mine who was he was in the ANC. He's still in the ANC, but he was really a fighter. He was in exile, had to leave, went to the United States. And, in those years, a lot of the ANC fighters were trained by Soviets.
Yeah.
And he once asked a Soviet colonel who was training him why it is that so many leaders in Africa and all over the world became corrupt, especially sometimes independence leaders who then, when they were in power, became corrupt. Right. And the answer that the Soviet colonel gave him, is which I'll never forget, is he said, it's because the good ones always die young.
Like this one.
And perhaps, there's a deeper truth to that, which is by the time you have a person who emerges and survives and climbs the hills and the ladders of politics, by the time they reach the pinnacle and stay there for a while, you no longer have people driven really by public good. There are exceptions to that. There are, of course, exceptions to that. But for the most part, it's true. Because if you look, let's say, at Africa, the history of Africa, a lot of the independence leaders who were these shining lights in the independence struggle against colonial powers, when they reached power, became kleptocrats. And it's really hard to understand that, really hard. I grew up in Africa in the 60s when it was paradise, in the post-independence euphoria. And even there, for example, even in Kenyatta's Kenya, I grew up in Kenya in the 60s, the really shining lights, someone like Tom Mboya, who was considered one of the really visionary, clean, incorruptible leaders, was assassinated. You understand? Because he was considered a threat. So you have these stories within each country, and they're, of course, very tragic. They're very tragic because you always ask yourself, what if? What would have happened?
Right. Yeah, and Patrice Lumumba was a shining star.
Of course. But he was naive. I'm working now with Congolese friends. Patrice Lumumba was the one who invited Mobutu into his palace.
Right. Yeah.
And Mobutu was a nobody. He didn't recognize that Mobutu was backstabbing him and would ultimately be his end, of course, with CIA support and so on. But Lumumba he didn't have the Machiavellian instincts to understand that. He lacked those completely.
Yeah.
We can admire him. But Mobutu was very cunning and very, very shrewd.
Mobutu was a journalist, and he became the head of the army in 1 or 2 years. It's a crazy story.
But Mobutu, in a conversation, I heard him say something quite incredible, and it also will stick with me forever. He talked about how his system worked, and he explained something very matter-of-factly. He said, let's say I need $5 million for some project, for a wife or for a new house. If I need $5 million, I will ask the head of the central bank for 20, because he will take 5. And his aide will take 5, and my aide will take 5, and I will take 5. And like that, I know I will get my 5. It was extremely cynical, but it was also extremely shrewd and aware of human beings. And Mobutu, you can say a lot of things about him, but he was not stupid.
No.
A lot of negative things, but he was not stupid. So to stay in power that way, and that was his greatness. That was absolutely his greatness. And of course, the disaster that became Zaire and then the DRC now.
Absolutely agree. We could say the same about the Arab world. When you see a wonderful country like Egypt, they had Nasser. You can have, of course, a lot of reserves about Nasser and his policy, but he was a great guy. Sadat shot, and now you have these new generations of leaders, and you see really a gap between, I don't want to enter into specifics, but between today's leader and Nasser, or even Sadat, in terms of vision and I can't help, asking, what if What if we had said that in the 80s?
Yeah.
You know, for
Nasser made mistakes. Nasser made a bad mistake with his Yemen campaign, of course. And let's not forget, in the 50s, in the Suez crisis, it was Israel together with Britain and France that tried to get rid of Nasser. And it was almost only a personal thing. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, just didn't like Nasser, and he just wanted to get rid of him. You know, the French had political reasons to do that. And had it not been for American intervention, Nasser would have ended then, but he never really quite survived that period. You know, so Nasser was somebody with his pan-Arabism, and he was an extremely charismatic leader. He was someone who was simply not acceptable because he had the ability to really create enthusiasm among his population. He wasn't acceptable also abroad because, of course, colonial history and neo-colonial history is that you want to have people that you can control in power.
Absolutely. The same happened in Algeria in '92 with Mohamed Boudiaf.
Yes.
It's the symbol of the nice guy, and he lasted 4 months, and they killed him.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe let's wrap up and go to the last question. You said a sentence in your book that really astonished me because I really think about it. Really, I agree with it a lot. You said that multiple roots equal no roots. I think it was in your introduction. Multiple roots equal no roots, too many beginnings, too many departures without goodbyes. I need maybe some insights on this because we live in the era of the citizen of the world. We are all the citizen of the world, the child of whatever. But I think that you have really there a point, you know, on what a policy is and your citizenship is, because life, the world is not a resort, is not a hotel. You are not living in a hotel room in your house. You are living in a community, in a country, with constitution, and so. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, some of it was a deeply personal statement about my own life because I had been uprooted and moved around as a son of a diplomat for so many years. So to some extent, it was that statement where it was almost an existence like Zelig, you know, in the Woody Allen character, where you adjust to your surroundings very well. My children make fun of me. They say they can tell who I'm talking to depending on how I change my accent, you know. So I think that ability to adapt, but I do believe in an age of ugly nationalism, which you see now, and you saw it in Europe in the last elections, you obviously see it in the United States in the last election, and all the ugly monsters that come up through that, where people no longer know how to distinguish between being a patriot and being nationalistic. You can be a patriot and feel strongly about your country. Nationalistic has a completely different connotation. And also this contempt that leaders feel for citizens of everywhere. So Theresa May with a famous statement, you know, a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. I feel that this type of ruthlessness gets belittled. I don't look at it that way as a negative. I quote in my book a statement that a famous French philosopher said. In French, I'll say it, but you can, you know the French. La culture, c'est ce qui reste quand on a tout oublié. Which is your culture. So it's quoted in the book. It's your culture is what remains when you've forgotten all else. And I think that's a healthy state. I think the ability to adapt is healthy. I think in the history of the world, certainly if you look at the last century, but throughout Europe of the last century, it's more important to redefine where you belong, where you feel culturally rooted and where you feel like you can make a contribution to society, rather than just by chance where you were born or what passport you carry. But of course, this is not a particularly popular position to take in an age of such rabid nationalism.
I got you. I got your point. Daniel, thank you very much. I think that we had a very rich tour around the world. I was not expecting to talk about Lumumba, but it's fantastic.
There you go. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We need to see another book.
The next one is on a different topic entirely. It's already written, but it's about something else.
Right. I will be one of your first readers, at least in the southern, at least in South America.
My pleasure.
And I hope that we'll see the Portuguese translation of this wonderful book.
I'll let you know.
Strongly.
Thank
Perfect,
you,
Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will disconnect now. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.